Hi everyone, this is Matthew Janner for Card Runners, and I'm here with the Theory of Donk Betting, Part 1. So as usual for my theory series, we're first going to go over an outline for the donk betting series. First, we'll have an introduction, where we'll talk about how we need to remove the mental block behind donk betting and why people don't usually donk bet. So I'll discuss exactly what I mean by this in much more detail in just a moment. Then we're going to get to the bulk of the part in the series where we're going to talk about the mathematics behind playing the flop in and out of position. This is where we're going to go over a lot of math and a lot of really theory-intensive stuff. What are the fundamental differences between an in-position flop bet and an out-of-position flop bet? We're going to be defining our value bet range and targeting our continuation bets. And once again, I'll explain what targeting means in more detail when we get there. We're going to be comparing donk bets to check calls and check raises and seeing how each line gives us different results with different types of hands. Then we're going to talk about what types of lines are possible when we donk bet compared to check. What are the results that can happen on the turn or the river, which will help us make a better decision on the flop for deciding whether or not we want to lead and bet out of position or if we should start off checking. Then we're going to go over easy examples of donk bets. As is usually the case when you're learning a new skill set, you want to make sure you know how to walk before you try to run. So by going over some easy examples first, we'll be able to sort of get a rough idea for what good donk spots look like. Then we can move on to more difficult and more debatable examples. Then we're going to talk about facing decisions after you donk, dealing with flop raises, and approaching turns and rivers. One of the reasons why people are probably more reluctant to donk bet than check is because they're used to checking to the pre-flop raiser out of position, and they're afraid when they donk, they don't know how it affects their opponent's range, and they don't know what to do on a lot of turn and river cards since they're less comfortable after donking. So we're going to talk about some of those spots so you're not going to be too uncomfortable when you first start approaching them. And then lastly, we're going to talk about donking applications in practice and hand examples. So this last part of the series isn't going to be as theory intensive as the first parts. We're still going to use a lot of the theory we already learned to decide whether or not we should donk in specific spots, but this is more of a how effective is donking in practice, how does it look in practice part, which will wrap up the series. Part 1, an introduction to donk betting. An example of a standard continuation bet spot. Imagine you open from middle position with king of spades, queen of spades, and you use a standard 18 to 20% opening range. Your opponent calls with a 9% cold call range in the cutoff, which includes jacks to fours, ace king off and ace queen suited to ace 10 suited, king queen suited to king jack suited, king and queen jack suited to 6-5 suited. So a pretty standard cold calling range. If the cold calling range you use looks slightly different, not a big deal. It's not going to affect the example much. The flop comes queen of clubs, 7 of diamonds, 5 of diamonds. How many of you are continuation betting this flop, and how many of you are check calling? So really take a moment to think. How many of you just think this spot is an auto c-bet? You don't even really run it through your thought process. You're just continuation betting because you've got top pair, second kicker. And how many of you actually think before you c-bet here and often mix in a check? Let's look at some of the math for it. Your opponent has you beat on the flop 14.7% of the time, and your opponent has a flush draw 9.5% of the time. I just plugged that into Flopzilla to get those numbers and did a little bit of math to take into account discounts and stuff. If your opponent defends 60% of his range, he already has you beat or has a strong draw against your hand 40% of the time once he calls or raises. So as I've talked about a lot in previous videos, how if you're betting the flop, your opponent's usually going to fold around 40% of the time. That way you're not making a ton of money when you c-bet. He's not just folding so much that you can continuation bet or later on in the video donk bet any two cards, yet by the same token, he's also folding enough that it gives you some incentive to bluff. If he's defending a lot more than 60%, you're probably not going to, bet the flop as a bluff very often because he defends so much. And if he's defending much less than 60%, then you're probably going to start betting all of your, air hands, even if you have a very, very weak bluff, which probably isn't good enough to bet as a bluff in theory. Your opponent will regularly raise ace, queen, or better and air and mix in some strong draws, turning king, queen into a bluff catcher. No one reasonable ever raises and stacks off queen, jack, or king, queen here. So, if you are c-betting this spot, you probably know when you get raised here, you're quite unhappy about it. You're out of position, there's a lot of draw on the board, and your opponent's never really raising anything worse, so you're just stuck with a bluff catcher, and he also has a pretty wide range that he can raise for value that beats your king-queen, because it's very common for a player to raise ace-queen or better here, which makes up quite a lot of combos. So just sort of think about this as we approach the next slides. Think, why are you c-betting here on this board? So now I want to go over an example of what I think most people would call a standard check call spot. Your opponent opens a 50% raise first in range on the button, and you flat in the big blind with queen of hearts, jack of clubs. So it's very standard for a button to open around half of his hands as a raise first in, and it's also very standard to call in the big blind with queen jack off. So everything's completely normal here. The flop comes jack of spades, six of spades, four of clubs. How many of you are donking in this spot, and how many of you are check calling this spot? Once again, take a moment to really think about it. My guess is the vast majority of people watching this video think this is a check call spot and it's not close, and they check call close to 100% of the time with this hand against almost all of their possible opponents. Your opponent has you beat 7.4% of the time and a flush draw 6.6% of the time. If he defends 60% of his range to your flop donk, he has you beat or a strong draw only 23.3% of the time. Your range is stronger than your opponent's by a very wide margin, and you would expect your opponent to try to only get one or two streets of value from most of the jack X hands that you beat. So by now you should probably be noticing it looks like something here isn't right. In the last example, where we were the pre-flop raiser and we c-bet, once our bet was called, our opponent had us either already beat or had a draw 40% of the time. Here, we're only beat 7.4% of the time on the flop, and he only has to draw 6.6% of the time. So once we bet, he's only going to have us beat or a strong draw 23.3% of the time. So queen jack in this spot right here is much, much stronger than king queen was in the last example when I used very standard ranges in both spots, though most of you, or at least a lot of you, probably would have guessed that the queen-king example looked like a much stronger hand with top pair second kicker than the hand looks right here when we have queen-jack off and we donked. On top of that, it also makes a lot of sense to want to bet all three streets with jack-high queen-kicker here, and our range is much stronger than our opponent's range. We hit jack-high flops much better than his range. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense that we would bet out of position in the last hand example, yet we would check out of position in this example, yet the vast, vast majority of people do it. So once again, keep this in the back of your mind as we start going over more math and talk about this more in a minute, because it should already start seeming like there's probably something wrong to you. So what is going on here? Why, when you check call in the first example with a hand much weaker relative to your opponent's range, are you likely to get flamed for posting the hand on 2+2 and told, LOL, bet the flop? Why is having a bluff catcher when your opponent raises you or constantly being lost on the turn and river after betting the flop acceptable here? Think back to that king-queen example that I'm talking about. If you get raised, you have a bluff catcher, yet you're probably okay with c-betting that board and just dealing with it when your opponent raises you and knowing you hold a bluff catcher. Likewise, you're probably also going to find on a lot of turn and river cards, when the turn or river brings a flush or an ace or a jack or anything else bad, you're going to think, you know what, I don't really know what to do on the river here. I'm not really going to get a lot of value from betting, yet I'm not in love with check calling either. My opponent's range is going to be very strong by the river a lot of the time. Yet once again, you're probably okay with that happening. You're okay with saying, you know what, I'm going to bet the flop, I'm going to bet the turn, then I'm going to deal with making a decision on a variety of river cards. Why are you okay with that, and why is most of the 2+2 culture okay with that? Why, when you donk the hand from example number 2 and do get raised or get a bad turn and don't know what to do, are you likely to get flamed for donking on 2+2 when you post it asking a question? Why is having a bluff catcher when you get raised or getting into a tough turn or river spot any different here than in example number 1? Think about it. If you bet the flop in the second example where you're donking with queen jack and you get raised and then your opponent falls through on the turn and you don't know what to do, if you post a hand like that or if you aim it to a friend, they're probably going to respond like, why are you donking the flop if you don't know what to do here? Well, we have a marginalish strong hand out of position. All the time we're not going to know what to do. So why is it okay in the first hand when we're the pre-flop raiser for us to be lost and not know what to do, yet it's not okay in the second example? The second example, we have a stronger range and we have a better hand that's behind less hands to our opponent. So why are we checking with the strong hand and betting the weak hand when they both face tough decisions when they get raised, and they both face tough decisions whether we bet or check the flop on a ton of turn and rivers? So what am I getting at? Optimal poker cares about each player's range, position, stack size, and the money in the pot. That's it. While the action of previous streets will determine what each range can look like at any given moment, it doesn't actually care about initiation. So, the reason why optimal poker would care about what happened on previous streets is simply because the action of the previous streets will tell you what your range and your opponent's range can look like. That's the reason why the action of earlier streets mattered, because it helps you tell what each range looks like. Now, if you're like me, you've been trained to think, I'm the pre-flop raiser, therefore I should be Doyle Brinsoning it up and betting, raising, or folding. Power poker, baby. You've probably been trained to think of initiative in the same way you think of position, like it's something valuable and worth fighting for, since you'll get to keep it on the following street. I've been taught this when I was learning how to play poker. People really stressed to me the importance of initiation, that it's something really good, it's something you really want to have, because initiation lets you win more money. Yet initiative isn't something real like position. It doesn't make every hand in your range more valuable like position. All it does is change the way your range and your opponent's range looks, and often not in a favorable way. We must remove this mental block. While it's true who has the initiative will change how each player's range looks, it does not matter in any other way. Ranges matter, initiative doesn't. If everyone incorrectly cares about initiative despite it not actually mattering, then it might actually have some value because it changes how people play against us, even though it shouldn't. If we know people incorrectly play different based on whether or not we have initiative, even if all players' ranges are the same, it gives us the opportunity to exploit them. If you're exploiting the fact that people assign value to initiative, then go ahead and keep doing it. Don't stop doing it, but you need to make sure you're exploiting your opponent and understand how, rather than just going along and doing what everyone else does when there's a big opportunity to improve here. We will now discuss the reasons why I think people care about initiative and are afraid to donk bet. Understanding why this mental block exists will be the first step required to removing it. Reason number 1. In practice, bad players usually like to call weak hands. Imagine 25 years ago there is no internet poker and you're playing a live full ring cash game. Your table has 3 very tight players, 3 average players, and 3 very loose players. This is what poker actually probably looked like 25 years ago. When your raise first in gets called, it will usually be by one of the 3 very loose players. Even if your table is equally represented by loose players and tight players, calls are always overrepresented by loose players with the weak ranges. This should intuitively make sense. Even though there's the same amount of tight players and tight players and loose players, the loose players are the ones usually putting their money in the pot, so they're the ones you're usually playing against. You thus are constantly against very weak calling ranges. You become accustomed to the calling range consisting of much weaker hands than the pre-flop raising range. It doesn't matter if this is theoretically optimal or not. This is how poker plays in practice, and by plays in practice I mean 25 years ago. Who cares if this is theoretically incorrect? We just want to make money, and the way to do it against awful players is to just focus on exploiting them. Soon enough, the pre-flop raiser having a much stronger range than the cold caller and having the responsibility to continuation bet to make weak ranges fold becomes universally accepted. Books are written stressing this concept, and few players ever get good enough for this strategy to stop working. So hopefully you can very clearly see where this idea comes from, that the pre-flop raiser should have a much stronger range than the cold caller, because in practice they used to usually have that. And then since the pre-flop raiser has a much stronger range than the cold caller, it should be the one usually c-betting with the strong range, even though it's often out of position. This isn't really necessarily true, but this is probably where the idea came from. Reason number 2, donking changes the rules of the game. There are several lines that most players take so rarely that it's almost as if they're not allowed in the game. People don't check raise as the preflop raiser almost at all. People don't overbet very often. You'll occasionally see people do it, but they probably don't do it anywhere near as often as they theoretically should, and most players probably don't even have that as a weapon in their arsenal. And then lastly, what we're talking about right here, people very, very rarely donk wide ranges on mini flops. There's many players that almost never donk unless it's a super obvious spot, almost never overbet, and literally never check raise as the preflop raiser. These are valuable weapons to have in your arsenal, but people good enough to use them are also probably good enough to win by the same game everyone else is playing, where these lines are only taken incredibly rarely and usually from exploitative standpoints. It's often easier to just keep playing the same game everyone else is playing rather than work hard away from these tables to develop these weapons. And if you do develop them, why talk about them openly when such little information has been written about them? So, if you're good enough to learn how to do this stuff on your own, you're probably also good enough to not need them. And then if you don't need them, it's always tempting to keep playing your same game that's been winning money consistently and letting you move up in stakes consistently until you kind of hit that brick wall where you actually have to develop them because there's other players that are too good that you can't just keep playing the same, by the same rules everyone else is playing. Most people never get to that level. I was only donk betting for a few months before April 15th. It felt like I would imagine 3-bet bluffing felt in 2002. It was a weapon I had that very few others had, and while I do think in 2020 most players will know how to use it a lot better, I loved having access to it now before others. Lastly, and this one's pretty simple, if you do have access to information that you think most people don't know about and it's letting you win more money on the tables, that's the kind of information you're usually not going to want to post or share publicly on forums. You might talk about it on AIM or Skype with other friends, but that's usually the kind of stuff that you don't want getting widespread because you really want to make as much money as you can while you're still the one that's donk betting before it's been, absorbed by the poker community. Reason number 3, donking into tough spots isn't culturally acceptable. It's very common for players to develop in 3 stages when it comes to facing tough spots. The first stage is a beginning player takes bad lines which put him into many tough spots which could have easily been avoided. Everyone here probably has a friend or two that's a beginning player. He gets aimed a hand history where he's in a tough spot, and that tough spot was just so completely avoidable if your friend wouldn't have taken that bad line pre-flop or that bad line on the flop. Stage 2 is when an intermediate player has learned how to avoid tough spots but is now overcompensating. Some tough spots are completely unavoidable, and taking the line, which makes your hand easier to play, yields a lower EV. This is one of the most common leaks I see in small stakes and micro stakes players, is they're trying so hard to dodge tough spots that they end up taking lines which yield a lower EV simply because they don't want to deal with possibly making a mistake on the turn or the river or not knowing what to do on a couple of river cards. These are usually winning players that are doing this too, by the way, in stage 2. Stage number 3 is an expert player has learned to try to take the most plus EV line in all situations. He thinks several streets and actions ahead, but will not shy away from the most plus EV line even if it leads to very tough turn and river spots for him and his opponent. So really good players are not afraid of the tough spot. They're not afraid to call down knowing their life's going to suck on tons of turns and rivers. They'll try to avoid needlessly tough spots that they don't need to get into, but they're not going to shy away from tough spots simply because they know they're going to end up folding the best hand sometimes or calling with the worst hand sometimes. Spots where you donked and get put into a tough spot are usually considered to be tough spots that should be avoided, even if they shouldn't be. Few people are good enough to understand donking, and the ones that aren't usually the ones posting on poker forums, giving you free help when you're trying to improve your donking play. I think it's really easy to forget that there's sort of a culture to poker, especially if you're a professional or semi-professional player and you're used to constantly being in a world of the internet and lollercats, but there really is a culture to poker players, and for some reason when it comes to actually playing, I still just think donking is one of those things that people have not yet accepted, and people are, some pretty good players are very intrigued by the idea, but they still really dislike it when you either ask them about a donking hand because it requires them to really think and it just puts them completely out of their comfort zone, and maybe even draws attention to the fact that there's a whole huge area of poker that they know nothing about when they already consider themselves pretty strong players. So just my 2 cents on that one. Summarizing the reasons. While more reasons certainly exist, I believe these are the three main reasons. Most information available encourages you to check to the preflop raiser. Few players have written or openly discussed the concept of donking, and when players do have donking questions and post them in the low-stake forums, they'll usually receive unhelpful and incorrect responses. So now that we have somewhat of an idea for why people don't like to donk bet, we're ready to move on to part 2, the mathematics to playing the flop in and out of position, and try to remove ourselves from that mindset that we should always be checking to the preflop raiser. Firing all three streets for value with a perfectly polarized range. Imagine you have a range of pure nuts and pure air hands which have either 100% or 0% equity, and you want to make a 0.5 pot size bet on all three streets. I realize ranges never consist of hands which only have 0% or 100% equity, and we will discuss more complicated situations shortly. Once again, as I mentioned at the beginning, we want to learn to walk before we can run, so I'm going to start out with the simplest possible model, and we're slowly going to go into more complicated models and then eventually try to tackle real-world situations. I also realize if your range was pure nuts or pure air, we would be betting large enough to get all the money in on the river, but I am trying to illustrate a concept at the moment and will later focus on more accurate real-world examples. So if you're already kind of theoretically past what we're talking about now, if you've already seen my bet sizing theory, this is probably going to be reviewed for the next few minutes, but I need to get this information out there for all the people who haven't already seen it. When you bet 0.75 pot size bets on the river, your opponent risks 0.75 pot size bets to win 1.75 pot size bets. Your opponent only needs to be good when he calls your river bet 0.3 or 30% of the time to break even. We can thus conclude if we want to make our opponent indifferent to calling our river bets, we want a 7-to-3 ratio of value bets to bluffs. We should thus design our flop value betting to bluffing ratio so we get to the river with 7 value betting hands for every 3 bluffs. So all I'm saying is here is when we're trying to figure out what our value betting to bluffing ratio should be on the flop, we want to realize what our end goal is. Our end goal is we want to be betting the river with a balanced range so there is a certain set of hands in our opponent's range or he's indifferent to calling. If we bluff the river too much, then he's always going to call with all of his marginal strength hands because he knows he's going to win too much. If we're bluffing too little, then he's going to always fold everything because our opponent always has a bluff catcher and we know we're not bluffing enough for him to ever justify a call. So our goal here is to get to the river with 7 value betting hands and 3 bluffs. Perfectly polarized betting ranges, slide 2. The turn is trickier. While our opponent is still only risking 0.75 pot size bets to win 1.75 pot size bets, he knows we'll have another street behind to balance out some bluffs with our value bets. Remember, as we talked about in the previous slide, we're always betting 0.7 pot size bets on all 3 streets. Once we bet the river with a balanced range, our opponent has effectively broken even with his bluff catcher. He now has a 0 EV, call, or fold. It doesn't matter what he does, he's already lost all the money he's put into the pot at that point. If we want to make our opponent indifferent to calling on the turn, we need to make sure we're betting the river 70% of the time with a balanced range. So remember, our opponent is risking 0.75 pot size bets to win 1.75 pot size bets, and as we saw on the previous slide, he only needs to win 30% of the time for him to justify a call. Since he needs to win 30% of the time, we need to make sure we're betting the river 70% of the time to keep him indifferent to calling on the turn, because once we bet the river, he's essentially already lost. River betting frequency times value betting frequency on the river is 70% times 70%, which equals 49%. So if we need to be betting the river 70% of the time, and we need to be having value once we bet on the river 70% of the time, then we can conclude we need to be betting for value 49% of the time when we bet the turn. We, of course, never win once we check the turn, since we would never check a value hand against our opponent's range of only bluff catchers, and he would never bet a bluff catcher. It just doesn't ever make sense for our opponent to bet, because he knows we either have 100% or 0% equity, and he doesn't ever need to protect his hand by betting. So since he never bets, we would never check a strong hand, and once we do check, we're always going to lose. Perfectly polarized betting ranges, slide 3. The same process would occur on the flop as occurred on the turn. Our opponent risks 0.75 pot size bets to win 1.75 pot size bets, so we need to follow through and bet the turn 70% of the time with a balanced range to make him indifferent to calling on the turn. Turn betting frequency times river betting frequency times value betting frequency on river equals 70% times 70% times 70%, which gives us 34.3%. Our flop betting range would consist of 34.3% value hands and 65.7% bluffs, which is very close to a 2-to-1 ratio of value bets to bluffs. So in this example where we have either 100% or 0% equity on the flop, we know we want to make sure when we do bet the flop, our range consists of 34.3% value hands, and then our opponent is going to be indifferent to every action he can take on every single street. Understanding the change in frequencies. As you can see in this simplified model, the frequency at which you can be bluffing changes greatly based on how many streets are left to act. We can bluff around 66% of the time on the flop, 51% on the turn, and 30% on the river. A very common leak people have is they don't realize how much you can be bluffing on the flop and how rarely you can be bluffing on the river. It's very important that you understand this concept. Even if you don't memorize all the frequencies, which aren't something important that you need to do, you need to understand you're allowed to bluff a lot on the flop, you're allowed to bluff a medium amount on the turn, and you're not allowed to bluff very much on the river. The more streets there are left to act, the more you're allowed to be bluffing, because on each additional street, you bluff a little bit less, and finally you get to the last street, in this case the river, with a very balanced range. So bluff a lot at the beginning, and then don't bluff very much at the end when you're on the final street. Polarized betting ranges versus marginal made hands, slide 1. Now let's imagine a similar example, only this time our range no longer consists of hands with 0 or 100% equity. Our range consists of value hands with 80% equity and bluffs with 20% equity. So we have V equals 0.8 for 80% equity and B equals 0.2 for 20% equity. Assume once again we want to bet 0.75 pot size bets on all 3 streets. We'll know whether or not we have the best hand, and we'll always lose once we check to our opponent. Remember, we're designing our range to be balanced against our opponent's marginal made hands, which make up a huge fraction of his range. These are very reasonable assumptions here. Now, I realize, of course, that this isn't exactly how it actually works when you're playing against your opponent. For example, sometimes you're going to check the turn with the intention of giving up, your opponent's going to check back, and then you're going to end up winning at showdown when you improve on the river. But this is a much more accurate representation of how ranges actually work than our previous example, because now our value range only has 80% equity, because sometimes our value range is just going to get bad turns and bad rivers and will not be able to bet all 3 streets for value. Likewise, sometimes our bluffs are going to improve. And if you play around with, Flopzilla, if you play around with Poker Stove, you'll probably start to realize that 80% equity for value hands and 20% equity for bluffs is a pretty reasonable assumption on a lot of boards. There's going to be different board textures where you're going to have more or less equity with value hands or more or less equity with bluffs, but nevertheless, this is a more accurate representation of how it will actually work than the previous model. Polarized betting ranges versus marginal made hands, slide 2. Just like before, we want to be able to bet the turn 70% of the time, the river 70%, and have value on the river 70%, which requires us to bet 34.3% of our flop betting range for value on the river. Now note the wording here is a little bit different. We're not saying we have to bet 34.3% value hands on the flop. We're saying we need to be able to bet all 3 streets 34.3% of the time after we bet the flop. We now need to find the ratio of value bets to bluffs when our value bets have 80% equity and our bluffs have 20% equity. V times X plus B in parentheses 1 minus X equals 0.343. So now we're going to plug in for V and B, so we get 0.8 times X plus 0.2 times in parentheses 1 minus X, which equals 0.343. So this equation is saying that our value hands have 80% equity, so we expect them to be able to bet all 3 streets 80% of the time. Once again, that's not an exactly precise answer, because as we'll talk about later, just because your value hand has 80% equity doesn't mean you're betting all three streets 80% of the time, but it's a model, and that's the assumption that we're using right now. So 0.8 times x, and then this x right here, if you look, 1 minus x plus x, so that's the amount of bluffs we have, which is going to be 1 minus x, plus the amount of value hands we have, which is going to be x, is going to add up to 1, which will be our 100% or our entire range. So 1 minus x plus x equals 1. All our value hands plus all our bluffs are going to equal 100% of our range. Then our bluffs have 20% equity, so we have 0.2, and then we have the bluffs 1 minus x. And total, we need to be betting all three streets 0.343 or 34.3% of the time. So now we simply solve for x. We get 0.8x plus 0.2 minus 0.2x equals 0.343. And then through the magic of algebra, we're left with x equals 0.238 or 23.8%. We now need even less bluffs than before, since more bluffs will become value hands than value hands will become bluffs on the turn and river. The net result is us needing less than 1 to 3 value bets to bluffs on the flop. We can bluff a lot for only a very few value bets. So this should hopefully make some sense to you. If we're bluffing a lot on the flop, but each of the bluffs only improves a little bit, that's going to more than make up for the fact that we're only value betting a little bit on the flop, and then only a small fraction of our value bets are not able to bet all three streets. So a good example of this for a real world situation would be if you're raising on the flop and you're only raising overpairs and sets and gut shots, you're pretty much going to be able to bet the overpair sets or the overpair and sets on pretty much any turn or river. There's going to very rarely be a really bad turn and river combination where you're going to maybe have to check the river, or you're not going to be able to bet all three streets because you have to check the turn. But for the most part, your value hands are going to keep betting. Likewise, gut shots aren't always going to be bluffs. Sometimes they're going to either improve on the turn or the river, and then now they're going to be moved to your value betting range. The net result of this is, since you're bluffing a lot on the flop and only value betting a little bit, is you now have more hands on the river which can be value bet because more bluffs improved than value hands weakened and weren't able to keep betting. So now let's talk about the differences between the model and real hands in a bit more detail than we already have. Honestly, these models are actually pretty accurate to how real poker works. A few of the key differences are: position is valuable. Sometimes we will check back a hand in position not good enough to bluff and hit a miracle card. When you check out of position with a hand that's not good enough to bluff and is going to be check folding, your opponent's just going to bet sometimes and you're going to have to fold. When you're in position, you're guaranteed to see the next card, and that gives you a chance to hit the gut shot or hit the two pair or hit the best possible pair if you have an ace high or something like that. So position's a very valuable thing that we haven't really taken into account in the model yet. We will sometimes check in position or out of position with a rivered marginal hand, and our opponent will check back a weaker marginal hand and we will win. Once again, that's not taken into account in the model. If you river second pair, but you were semi-bluffing with a gut shot, you were bluffing with a gut shot and you river, second pair, sometimes you're going to check back the river in position and win, and sometimes you'll even check the river out of position and you'll win. Obviously, you're more likely to win in position when your opponent doesn't get to, randomize some bets and some bluffs. But even out of position, you're sometimes going to check a rivered marginal strength hand and still win. The model doesn't take that into account. We can mix in check raises and check calls when we are out of position. This will usually occur when we turned or rivered a hand that works neither as a bluff or a value bet. So once we start mixing in check raises and check calls, as well as we add in the other differences I already mentioned, we're now getting to the point where we hardly even have a model anymore. We more or less have real poker and how real poker plays. So sometimes you're going to bet the flop and have the intention of either, double barrel bluffing or check folding the turn, but you're going to get, a turn or a river card which does a certain thing for your range and a certain thing for his range, where now you think check calling or check raising is the best line. The model obviously can't take that into account because that's way, way too complicated, but that's something that actually happens in real poker that we have to be aware of when we're really playing hands. You can change the numbers we used in the previous example. Maybe on some board textures you expect bluffs to have only 10% equity and value made hands 85% equity. Plugging in the numbers to this equation tells you an extremely accurate estimate for what frequency of your flop bets should be bluffs and is a very useful tool. So if you disagree with me, maybe you play heads up or full ring. If you think bluffs have more or less equity than 20% on average, or value hands more than or less than 80% equity on average, just plug in the numbers and get the new values and play around with them if you want. Obviously, if you were trying to be very precise, you'd be using a different ratio on every sort of different flop texture, because, on a flop texture that's, ace 9-2, bluffs are going to have ace 9-2 rainbow, bluffs are going to have a different amount of equity from a flop that has 9-6-4 with a flush draw. So you would get a different ratio for each different flop texture you looked at. The two that we've looked at so far, where value hands have either 100 or 80% equity and bluffs either 20 or 0% equity, got us between a 3-to-1 and a 2-to-1 bluffing to value betting ratio on the flop. So it is giving us a pretty good general idea and showing us the general trend that when you bet the flop, the vast majority of your range should be bluffs. We could also very easily add in a range of strong draws to our donking range, and we should, which have an equity between value made hands and bluffs. Just make sure your overall range will be able to follow through and bet the river for value enough. So as you remember, we needed to be able to bet the river, turn and river for value 34.3% of the time. Strong draws usually have around 40% equity. So strong draws have more equity and are going to be able to usually bet the turn and the river for value more than we need. So adding in some strong draws to our range do let us add in a little bit more bluffs, but a strong draw doesn't let us bluff nearly as much as a very strong made hand would. So that should intuitively make a lot of sense. If you're donking with a middle set, you can mix in a lot of bluffs to balance out the donk with the middle set. If you're donking with the nut flush draw, you're still allowed to have a tiny bit of bluffs or a fraction of a bluff, but you can't bluff nearly as much as you could with a set, because a flush draw is not always going to get to follow through on the turn or the river for value the way a set pretty much always is. So when you are designing these ranges, though, you're going to need to have a balanced donking range for when your opponent calls. You're not just going to have a very clear value hand or a very clear bluff. Sometimes you're going to have a semi-bluff or a strong draw, and you need to put that into the equation as well. So that'd be a very easy thing to do, and we're going to talk about it in just a minute, but keep that in mind. So now we come to a slide which explains one of my biggest aha moments that I've had in somewhat recent time, which is, what about just going for 2 streets of value? In position, 2 streets of value can make some sense. If you bet the flop and the turn, by the time you check back the river and reveal to your opponent you cannot have a very strong hand, you're already at showdown. Your opponent never gets a chance to bet with a range of value hands and bluffs against your medium strength range. So this is something that's very important to realize, and it's a very common strategy you'll often see good players use, which is they'll bet the flop in position, they'll bet the turn in position when they only want to get 2 streets of value, and they always check the river, because if they take that line, by the time their opponent realizes, wait a second, he can't have a very strong hand, he just checked, well, they're already at showdown. The opponent never gets a chance to bet with a range of value bets and bluffs against that medium strength range. Whereas if a player checks back the flop in position, he's already signaled, I don't have a very strong hand, and it makes it easier for his opponent to mix in bluffs against him, because he knows his opponent wouldn't check back a very strong hand on the flop. This is not the case out of position. If you bet the first 2 streets for value on the flop and turn and check the river, your opponent has the opportunity to bet against your marginal strength hands with a range of nuts and air. Going for 2 streets of value out of position is usually a bad idea. Hands strong enough to only get 2 streets of value usually work better as checks, since they keep your opponent's range wider and let you pick off bluffs. How often, especially if you're one of the newer players, have you bet the flop and the turn knowing you're going to be lost on the river? Simply because you're the pre-flop raiser and you think, hey, I can get value on the flop, so you bet the flop. Then you think, hey, I can get value on the turn, so you bet the turn. And then by the time you get to the river, you're like, oh, I don't think I can bet for value, but I also don't like check folding, but I also don't like check calling. That can be okay. Sometimes that can make sense. Of course, you can think of opponents, you can think of hand examples where that will make sense, but for the most part, planning on getting 2 streets of value is usually going to be a pretty bad idea when you're out of position, because you are always going to be stuck on the river checking and signaling to your opponent. You pretty much have a range that consists mostly of marginal strength hands. You can occasionally mix in a check call or a check raise on the river with a very strong hand, but even in theory, even if you are mixing in check calls and check raises, the majority of your range that makes sense to check the river is marginal strength hands. That causes a lot of problems, and it makes for a lot of tough river spots when you're just auto continuation betting with marginal strength hands on the flop and turn, because you think, hey, well, at least when he calls the flop, I'm getting some value. So if you're like me, then once you start to realize all this stuff, what you really need to do is you need to rethink your game. You're probably already used to checking with marginal hands to the preflop raiser when you're out of position. Yet you probably also very regularly auto c-bet the flop for value when you're the preflop raiser with hands too weak to bet. Bet real hands for value. You're allowed around 3 bluffs for every 1 value hand, so you can still be bluffing a lot even if you only bet strong hands. That's why the model we talked about earlier was so important. It really shows you, even if you're only betting pretty strong hands for value, each strong hand you bet for value allows you to have a whole ton of bluffs on the flop. So you're not just always going to be checking, even if you're only c-betting, a very strong range. How often does continuation betting at 9-9 on a queen 7-3 rainbow board really work for you, since you don't want to check call? Wouldn't you think it was an atrocious play if someone donked 9-9 on that board? What is the difference? How often does continuation betting 9-9 out of position on a queen 7-3 rainbow board really work for you, since you don't want to check call? Wouldn't you think it was an atrocious play if someone donked 9-9 on that board? What is the difference? Remember, either way, you're betting a medium marginal strength hand out of position on a queen 7-3 rainbow board. It does not make any sense why it's okay to do it if you're the preflop raiser, yet it's not okay to do it as the cold caller. It's probably a pretty bad line either way. You're just very used to, people don't want to check 9-9 on that board as the preflop raiser because they don't know what to do when their opponent bets. So they just take the easiest line possible and they just bet 9s on the flop, even though it doesn't actually accomplish anything, and they'd be much better off if they checked 9s and checked it with a very balanced range. Hands which are value bets should almost always be expecting to go for 3 streets for value, and occasionally only 2 if in position on some textures. Sometimes you'll get a bad turn and or river card for your specific hand and have to check, and that's totally fine. You may also want to check call or check raise on the turn or river if you get a specific turn or river card that works well for that with your range. So it's okay to check call the turn and check call the river. You probably just shouldn't go into the hand with that intention on most turn and river cards. Likewise, sometimes you'll be planning on bluffing only 1 street and get an awesome turn and follow through. You shouldn't always bet all 3 streets with value hands or decide on the flop how many streets you'll bet with a specific bluff. Just don't plan on only betting 1 or 2 streets for value out of position, or just 1 street in position. So I really want to take a moment to remind you that if you ever have a chance to exploit your opponent, you should always do it. So I'm not saying you should never bet the flop out of position with a marginal hand and then check call the turn and check call the river against some opponents. That's clearly going to be an excellent line against some players where that exploits them. I'm simply trying to stress how if you look at the math and you look at the theory, you can see how betting the flop and then being lost on the turn after you bet the flop for value with a marginal strength hand isn't really a very good line. So just for a moment, we're going to talk about it more in detail, but just to think about it now before we go on, if you only think you can get 1 or 2 streets of value from your opponent out of position, if you check the flop, you keep his range wider and you give him a chance to bluff. If he checks back the flop, then now you still have the turn in the river to go get your 2 streets of value. Whereas once you start betting on the flop, you make his range stronger, you make it harder for him to bluff, and if he does bluff, you're often going to end up folding. And it's just not nearly as effective as if you put in the original check. So before we can talk about what types of hands we should be betting with out of position, what hands we should be donking with, we first need to discuss how to play hands which only want 2 streets of value out of position. There is no possible way for you to avoid letting your opponent get in 3 bets when you're out of position and have a marginal hand. Because when you really think about it, that's kind of what you want to do, right? You have a hand that wants 2 streets of value, so one of the first things you're thinking about when you're out of position is there any way that I can make it so my opponent's only going to bet twice and no more? Well, if you check the flop, he can bet all 3 streets, so that doesn't work. If you bet the flop and check the turn, he simply bets the turn and the river. And if you bet the flop and bet the turn, he can bet the river. And that's what we talked about is the most common problem. You're betting the first 2 streets hoping to get value, and then you're simply lost on the river. Some advantages of checking the flop with hands which want 2 streets of value. It protects your range and encourages your opponent to give you free cards rather than always bet and take down the pot. So, when I used to play, I was still playing No Limit 200 2 or 3 years ago. I remember I used to actually check fold as the pre-flop raiser once I checked 99% of the time. And I still had a really, really good win rate when I did that. So obviously, it encouraged me to just keep doing that. But if you are doing that, it allows you against better opponents that they just always bet and always immediately take down the pot. Because if I'm only defending 1%, which is just laughably low, but even if I was defending 5 or 10% of my checks as the pre-flop raiser, I'm defending such a small frequency that my opponent's just going to bet his entire range and pretty much deal with a bet when it happens. Or he's going to bet 85 or 90% of his range and only check back the stuff that he really wants to check. But by protecting our range and defending more of our checks, now you give yourself a chance to have your opponent check back since he knows you're going to defend some checks, and then you can improve and then win on the turn or the river by getting a good card, or you can start bluffing on the turn or the river. So once again, it's one of those things where it's kind of amazing how much money I was able to win when I was playing that poorly, but as you move up in stakes, as people start slowly getting better and better, it's a leak you definitely want to fix, and my win rate could have been higher had I not had it. It also allows you to have an easy turn and river value bet when your opponent checks back the flop. It's incredibly rare your opponent's ever going to check back a nutted type hand on the flop or a very strong hand on the flop, and it's also very rare that he checks back a hand that improves to an incredibly strong hand on the turn. Usually he'll c-bet all of his draws, so he's not c-bet, sorry. Usually he'll bet in position all of his draws, so it's very unlikely he gets an amazing turn card. Rarely he'll, bink a set on the turn, but that's very uncommon. So when you do check the flop and your opponent checks back, now you can randomize some bluffs on the turn and on the river, and then you can also value bet the turn and the river, and now your opponent's the one kind of holding his marginal hands that check back the flop, not sure whether or not he wants to call down. So it's a very, very good thing to happen. Also, it keeps your opponent's range wider and allows you to pick off bluffs. If you start off with betting the flop for about 75%, your opponent's only going to continue 60% of his range. When you start off checking, your opponent's going to have 100% of his range, and he's going to bluff a lot of it. By checking the flop, you keep your opponent's range wider, and if you have sort of a marginally strong, not amazing hand out of position, that's usually going to be what you want to do. These are all very good reasons to check the flop out of position. Once you understand when and why you should donk bet, you'll also understand why you shouldn't be recklessly betting marginally strong hands out of position on the flop like you're likely doing now. So I approached this in kind of a backwards way, where I started to learn how to donk the flop, and then I started getting good results with that. And then once I started donking the flop pretty effectively, I started realizing, oh, it's not that much different when I'm the pre-flop raiser. I should probably be checking these hands that I wouldn't donk bet. So we're approaching it from a little bit of a different angle here, where we're first saying what hands are really bad to bet when we're out of position. Should we, what hands should we mostly be checking with? And then once we understand that, like hopefully you do now we can move on and start talking about what types of hands also work really well as donk bets. Now, just like how we talked about what some of the possible results are when you check out of position, now we need to talk about what some of the possible results are when you donk or bet out of position. What possible results can occur after a flop donk when your opponent continues? Well, your opponent can call your flop bet, turn bet, and river bet. This is going to be one of the most common ways you get to showdown. You simply bet all 3 streets like you would with most of your, if not all your value hands on the flop, and then your opponent decided to call you down because he has a mediumly strong or semi-strong hand as well. Your opponent can call your flop bet and turn bet and raise your river bet. So this will definitely happen some of the time, but usually it's pretty hard for your opponent to call both the flop and the turn with a slow played big hand. Usually there's going to be enough coordination and the board texture won't make it very easy for your opponent to call the flop and the turn to slow play, and if he does, he's taking a big risk. So if he does raise your river bet, that means he's probably either bluffing on the river or he improved on the river, and likewise you'll probably have improved on the turn and river with some of your hands as well, so you'll have some very strong hands that can call and also just have to look them up with a bluff catcher sometimes. Your opponent can call your flop bet and raise your turn bet. This is a reasonably common line for your opponent to take because, for example, if you donk on a Jack 7-4 rainbow board, he's not really that scared of slow playing anything, so often call your flop bet and wait to raise you on the turn. He has position and he's not afraid of any turn card. Whereas your opponent's less likely to do what we just talked about by calling the flop and calling the turn and raising the river, because on that Jack 7-4 rainbow board, if the turn comes like an 8 that gives a flush draw, now there's usually enough draw that your opponent won't want to slow play twice. So you're going to see this line from your opponent reasonably often, and your opponent can raise your flop bet. This is no different than if you're just c-betting as a pre-flop raiser. Good opponents are going to raise your flop bets a reasonable percentage of the time, and that's going to turn a very lot of your range into a bluff catcher. That's how it should theoretically work. There's nothing to really be too concerned about here. Donking works best with hands which want either 1 or 3 bets in on the flop. What does that accomplish? Well, 1 bet ensures your opponent doesn't get to outdraw you for free, but still keeps his range wide. 3 bets get so much money in on the flop that it effectively destroys the advantage of position, unlike a flop check raise, which we'll discuss shortly. So we're not going to get time to discuss it in this video, but one of the really big advantages to donking the flop is there's going to be a lot of board textures where a check raise just really doesn't work that well. And lastly, donking allows you to more easily represent strong hands on the turn and river than check calling does without bloating the pot like check raising does. So as we talked about with some of the lines your opponent can take against your flop donk bet, sometimes it's really hard for him to be able to represent a strong hand on the turn or the river if there was a lot of draw on the flop or a lot of draw on the turn. When you donk bet, you pretty much can represent a whole ton of hands on almost any possible turn or river board texture, and that's a really useful thing to be able to do and one of the really awesome things about donking. So now I want to do a summary of part 1. What have we learned so far in this video? Well, first we learned about mental blocks. You're probably much more likely to bet the flop out of position when you're the pre-flop raiser than the cold caller for no real justifiable reasons. You're just very much in the mindset that the pre-flop raiser should be the one who bets. This makes sense when we think about how most people were taught to play poker. Players were taught that initiative is something that matters and it's something that you should fight for because it's something that's useful to have on later streets. We also talked about the flop value to bluffing ratio. Very few value bets on the flop relative to bluffs. Usually 2 or 3 bluff bets for every 1 strong value bet. This was a very important ratio because it told us that we should have several bluffs for every 1 hand we value bet on the flop. And since we're allowed so many bluffs for every 1 hand we value bet, we really want to make sure we're pretty much only betting our strong and very strong hands for value on the flop or our draws to balance out that range, and then betting a lot of bluffs because we don't want to always be betting our entire range on the flop, and we're allowed so many bluffs for every 1 value hand. So this is an incredibly important ratio to remember, and we're going to be using it a lot in the next video. We also talked about checking the flop out of position. We need a very good reason to bet the flop with the intention of only getting 1 or 2 streets of value in when we're out of position. We should polarize our betting range. Now, this doesn't mean you're never going to be check calling or check raising the turn or check calling or check raising the river. It simply means you shouldn't be betting the flop most likely if you're often going to find yourself lost to a turn or river bet and you know you're not going to be able to bet the turn or the river for value. If you get a tough turn or a tough river card, that's totally fine to be lost, but don't go in planning to be lost. You're usually going to be better off just checking on the flop then. Target your bets so you know how many streets of value you can get and you're playing your hand in a way that manipulates your opponent's range the way you want to. I mentioned targeting very briefly in the first few slides, but we didn't talk about it much. But since I'm cutting off kind of halfway through the part where I was going to talk about targeting, I wanted to mention it now. There is a very big difference between whether or not you donk bet the flop, whether or not you check raise the flop, whether or not you check call the flop, or whether or not you check and your opponent checks back. Each one of those lines makes your opponent's range look quite a lot different. So we really want to be thinking like, what does this bet accomplish? What are we doing with my hand in this specific range so it's accomplishing the goals we want and manipulating our opponent's range the way we want to? We're going to talk about that a lot more in the next video. And lastly, Donking makes it very easy for us to represent wide, balanced ranges on the turn and river, and if our opponent raises us on the flop, we can destroy his positional advantage. There's some really great things that happen when we donk bet, and those are two of the really big main things. If our opponent does decide to raise us on the flop when we 3-bet, it's almost like he's not in position anymore. The pot's going to be so big, with his stack size so small relative to the pot size on the turn and the river, that we really destroyed his positional advantage. Similar to the way when you 4-bet pre-flop, you're kind of destroying your opponent's positional advantage if he 3-bet you from in position. So that's one of the really big advantages. The other is if we're donking very wide balanced ranges on many different board textures, it's going to be very hard for us to get to the turn or the river after donking the flop and following through on the turn without having a lot of very strong hands in our range and a lot of really good hands to bluff with. So donking makes it very, very easy for us to have a nice, wide, balanced range. So now we're at the end of the video. First off, thanks for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Comments are always welcome in the forums. Feel free to give me feedback and ask me questions. Start thinking about what types of hands make sense to donk between now and when the next video releases. It's always good to try to, get some idea of what you should be doing on your own without just having someone else tell you it. That'll help you become a stronger thinker, and you might find something that you think I did that was wrong or where you disagree with me. And good luck at the tables. So bye everyone. Take care.